All right, so Tuesday's lecture was Pilgrims Part 1, and this lecture is equally cleverly titled Pilgrims Part 2. William Bradford was about 30 years old when the Mayflower entered Plymouth Harbor in November 1620. His wife Dorothy had sailed with him, but the couple had talked it over and decided to leave their 3-year-old son John back in England with friends. As it turned out, a very wise decision, because the trials of this sojourn into the wilderness were just beginning. And while Bradford, along with others, were away and exploring the countryside, trying to figure out where's water, where are they going to build their settlement, all those things have to be decided, Dorothy fell over the side of the ship and drowned. Some historians have speculated that she committed suicide, but probably not. May have. No one can rule something like that out. But according to Puritan belief and Catholic belief at the time, suicide is a sin. So not likely. And given that it's wintertime and the decks are icy, easy to imagine she fell overboard. In the midst of such tribulations, such a blow might have destroyed lesser men. Not Bradford. He did not give up. Much later in life, 30 years or so, reflecting on his wife's death, he wrote, "Faint not, poor soul. In God still trust. Fear not the things thou suffer must. For whom he loves, he does chastise." That's an old word meaning test, correct. And then all tears wipes from their eyes. The Pilgrims and Christians in general throughout the ages, and Christians now, view life as a test, a trial. Life has a purpose: to serve God, to help God build His kingdom, the kingdom of Jesus Christ. James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, comment on this purpose. Right? Comment on life as a test, as a trial. You may be a Christian, and this is the first time you've heard that life is a test. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, tests, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. God, why did you do this to me? Do you not think that William Bradford asked that question after he learned that his wife had died? God, I am your servant. Look what I have done. I've crossed the ocean for you. And let endurance have its perfect result. You're being tested so that you may one day be perfect in faith. You can't get there without passing tests and building strength of faith, so that you may be perfect and complete in the Christian faith. That's Christianity, folks. That is a complete different view than even that expressed by the Dalai Lama. The purpose of our lives is to be happy. The Puritans and Christians who understand their faith laugh at that. If happiness comes along the way of serving Christ, great. And I think He wants you to be happy in your service. Okay, I do. I think you will be if you are serving Him in your call. But it's not the kind of happy that the culture you live in tries to foist out on you. And so you have a choice to make as a Christian. Are you going to follow the culture that you live in, which is non-Christian? Or are you going to understand this world in terms of your Christian faith? When trials come, are you going to understand that they're coming to all Christians? Or are you going to say, God, why me? I thought you loved me. I thought I was never going to have any trials or tribulations because you loved me. You know, some churches preach that. They are not serving you well. Are not preparing you for life. So have a good time if you're following the secular view. But that's not Christian. You have work to do. You have preparations to make to serve Christ. Though the passage over the Atlantic had been death-free, nobody died, although they thought they were going to. Once they dropped anchor, people started to get sick. They'd been without the necessary vitamin C and so forth, so that scurvy began to develop, both in the crew, but also in the pilgrims and the strangers, and they started to get sick. 3 men died as the ship lay at anchor. The first building that they had managed to create, the common house, became a hospital. And then as people joined the ranks of the sick, then that common house was filled with cots from wall to wall. There were so many sick people that at one time there were only a half a dozen who weren't sick, and they spent all their time, of course, tending to the ill. Oh God, why are you doing this to us? And people died. February and March were the worst months. Sometimes 2 or 3 people a day passed away. The ground is frozen, covered in snow. You can't bury them, but you got to take them outside and lay them in the snow. And the pilgrims knew that the Indians were watching, and they're not friends with these Indians. Both sides looking at each other very, very suspiciously. And so the pilgrims decided that when they knew the Indians were out there, that even the sick would have to get out of their beds and trudge to the kind of half-made walls and barricades that they were using to protect themselves and prop themselves up long enough in the snow to make it look as if the pilgrims were stronger in defense than they really were. And by the end of March 1621, nearly everyone had lost someone. Even Christopher Martin, the leader of the Pilgrims, died, leaving a vacuum of leadership that the young Bradford would eventually and reluctantly, I'm not qualified, fulfill. And as it turned out, he was more than qualified. But that's what the best leaders think. I'm not worthy. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, I'm not worthy. Can I do this? It is the arrogant who say, oh yeah, I got this, no problem, I got it handled. 3 families were entirely wiped out. 5 children were left orphans, parents gone. One of those included 17-year-old Priscilla Mullins. By April 1621, 52 of the 102, just over 50%, had died. Half their number gone. The sailors were also hit hard. One of them, 18-year-old John Alden, decided to stay with the Pilgrims and not sail back to England. As it turned out, John Alden had an eye for Priscilla. And the Alden family is going to be one of the great families of New England. How many of us would have given up our faith or gone home under such trial? Why did I ever come here? Or worse yet, a wife saying to a husband, why did you ever bring me here? And how about her on her deathbed? Why did you do this to us? You want that resonating in your ears for the rest of your life, men? No. And yet it happens. But what did Bradford write? I have to admit, this awes me. I thank God I've never been tested like this. Given the circumstances, he was astonished, not that so many had died, but that so many had lived. You see, it's his expectations of what life was about, his theology that allowed him to handle this situation. One must expect tests and trials in life. And so, not a surprise. Now, keep in mind context. What's the life expectancy for anybody back in England? People live to 80, 90 years old all the time? No. Childhood mortality, to get to be 18, you got about a 1 in 2 chance. Children died all the time. Men and women remarrying after the death of a spouse is common as, well, it was very common. You live in a completely different world where the death of a child is strange, odd. The death of a spouse before they're 75, very, very rare. Yeah, thanks to modern medicine. Thanks to the taming of the wilderness. But not then. So while this kind of death was unusual, death was not. Bradford wrote, "Ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, our fathers were Englishmen which came over this great ocean and were ready to perish in this wilderness. But they cried unto the Lord, and he heard their voice and looked on their adversity." No doubt Bradford is remembering the children of Israel on their sojourn out of Egypt, in which they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and the entire generation passed away, right? Because they had not been faithful. You see, this is why correct theology is so important for Christians. It's all about your expectations. If you expect something, you can handle it most of the time. If you get blindsided, you're devastated. If your theology leads you to believe that nothing difficult, no disaster will ever come your way because you're a Christian, not only are you wrong, you're disastrously wrong. You're setting yourself up for a crisis of faith when troubles come. And troubles will come. You will be tested by God. But God doesn't bring all the tests. Life just has trials. As I said, James 1, 2 through 4. Consider it all joy, my brethren. I could have put I don't know how many different scriptures up there for this. The Indians. Several tribes of Indians lived in the area, among them the Massachusetts, where we get the modern name of the state. The Narragansetts out in the western part of this part of New England. And the Poconokeets, who lived about 40 miles from Plymouth, but between the Narragansetts on the other side, on the western side, and then the Poconokeets, and then Plymouth on the coast. And there are dozens of other tribes and villages, okay? So, hallelujah, you don't have to memorize them. And Europeans had been coming to New England for some time, and so these Native Americans were not in awe of these pilgrims and their great canoe. Right. Many of these Europeans who had come earlier had taken captives from the Indians, so the Indians were wary of these Europeans. They took people away. But they had also inadvertently left diseases amongst them. Amongst the Indians. European diseases for which the Indians had no natural resistance. And so along the coast side, near where Plymouth was, the little villages there had been wiped out by disease. The farther one went inland, the less the diseases had taken their toll. And there had been an explorer by the name of Thomas Dermer who had been there on that coast just a few months before the Pilgrims got there. And because of what the previous explorers had done in terms of taking captives and such, the Indians decided the best thing to do was simply to attack the Dermer party and wipe them out. That's not a bad deduction if I'm a Native American, right? Probably what I would have done. And so now the Pilgrims show up, and this massacre of the Dermer party is in the minds of the Native Americans who are nearby, and so they think the Pilgrims are there to take revenge for Dermer. That'd be their natural conclusion. So talk about hostile, wary. Now Massasoit. Massasoit of the Pokanokuts was the most important Indian chief. Another word for this is sachem in the region. Nevertheless, this power rested uneasily on his shoulders, for the Native Americans were often in conflict with one another. If you heard in grade school or in junior high or in high school that the Native Americans always got along with one another, that was a lie. Put that out of your mind. If that was true, why would these tribes have warriors? Why would they have weapons of war? Why would they not all be on the same page and all a bunch of happy campers? Not the case. Let's not dehumanize the Native Americans that way. What does the Bible say about all human beings in terms of sin? For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Just not all Christians. Not all Europeans. Just all. A book that was written in the Middle East. Okay? Europeans aren't even thought of. All. Mankind. They are as human as you and I. Both in all the good things that means, but also in all the bad things that means. And so Massasoit is the head man in the region, but his power is tenuous. It's always being challenged, right? The Native Americans were often in conflict with one another. This is the key to understanding this history. Yes?
So was he like a chief over multiple, like a group of tribes?
Yes. Allied tribes. The tribes are, in a sense, independent, but they're allied with Massasoit as the head, but not all of them fall into this alliance. There are those who are outside the alliance, okay? As I said, there are virtually dozens of small tribes in the area, and some of the tribes are larger. The Narragansetts out to the west are a large tribe, yes.
And was that the Massachusetts, the Narragansetts, and the Pokanokuts?
Yeah? What about them?
Oh, I was just asking if he was over them.
So Massasoit is over the Narragansetts, but that's one of the places where his power is very tenuous. Okay? In fact, that tribe had not been reduced by disease. Why? They're farther west. They're away from the coastline, all right? And so their power had stayed roughly the same, whereas the Pokanokuts had suffered to some extent from disease. They're closer to the coast. Adding to this normal instability was the arrival of an epidemic. This is the disease that caused so much trouble. We think about 1617, bubonic plague arrived in New England, in this area. And so the plague wiped out whole villages as the Native Americans had not developed a resistance to it. The Pokanokuts were hit pretty hard. I just said the Narragansetts, not so much. And the Narragansetts were Massasoit's most unruly subjects, looking for an opportunity to throw off his yoke, if you will. And so the situation now is primed for trouble. So as a result, the Pokanokuts were severely outnumbered. The Narragansetts could raise 1,000, maybe more warriors, and Massasoit and his alliance maybe only a few hundred. All of these are estimates. Enter now the pilgrims who had landed in a region that had clearly been inhabited, but was now this region I'm talking about, right along the coast. Okay? As they're exploring right along the coast, it is absolutely clear that the people had lived there. Their villages were there. There were skeletons laying about, but they're gone. And the pilgrims saw this eerie vacancy, and they took it as a sign. What would they think? Take a guess. Yes.
They thought it was a gift from God.
There you go. They thought it was a gift from God. That God had removed these people from their immediate midst in order to make a place for them. They saw themselves as God's people. They even described themselves as his new Israel. Did God make a place for Israel in the land of Canaan? You bet he did, according to the Old Testament prophets and historians, right? And so that's what these pilgrims thought was taking place. God had made them a place. But the pilgrims were in need of friends, and they knew it. As were the Poconokeets. But neither at this moment were disposed to see the other as a friend, for all the reasons I've described. Which brings us to Squanto and an alliance. For months, the Indians and the Pilgrims eyed one another suspiciously. Massasoit was not inclined to be kind, but the Pilgrims did not provoke him. And eventually, Massasoit's counselors advised him that maybe some kind of an accommodation might be made with these pilgrims. The Pilgrims wisely treated the Indians with respect and received Massasoit as a great king. Now, fear for their own lives has something to do with this, okay? But there are many examples in history where people could be fearful for their own lives, but they let their hatred and their racism get in the way anyway, okay? So let's give these people some credit. They treat Massasoit and his people with respect. Now, an Indian named Squanto, how many of you have heard of Squanto in grade school? Yeah, pretty unanimous. Or perhaps a little bit later along, junior high, high school? Yeah. When I was in grade school, half the class dressed up as Squanto. And the other of us, we all had our white colors and our black clothes on and such. Pilgrims. For months, as I said, the Indians looked at each other, the Indians and the Pilgrims looked at each other, and then Squanto made himself known. Squanto had been captured by some of those previous white explorers and traders, taken away. But he was not sold into slavery. He did not die of disease. What are your odds if you're taken to Europe, if you're a Native American in this time, of dying of disease? 90%. And then he gets away from the people he was staying with. It's not slavery, but he wasn't exactly free either. And he finds his way back to a ship, and he comes back to the New World, back to his homeland. Is that not amazing? What do you think the Pilgrims thought about Squanto? Another what? Another gift from God. Because in his sojourns, he had learned English. He can speak English, and he can speak the native dialects. And there he is, ready to act as an intermediary between the Pilgrims and the Poconokeets. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that God had a hand in this, but I'm not saying he didn't either, okay? History is one thing, maybe is another. In history, you have to have evidence, preferably something written down. In this case, we would need a note from God, okay? I chose Squanto, and I directed his life. You're not going to get that. What we're going to get is what people thought, okay, in this case. So there's no history to say that God did this or God did that. We all clear on that? Okay, you think what you want. It's an accident or God did it. Well, eventually that first summer, the Puritans and Pilgrims made a treaty. They made a treaty not only of peace, okay, that's a nice first step, but at the same time, they made a treaty of military alliance. They are going to trust one another and come to each other's aid in case there is trouble with who? Other tribes. The Puritans are going to fight with the Pilgrims against other Indians. The Pilgrims are going to stand up with the Puritans against Indians. They're going to be friends. Is that not amazing? 1621. The first Thanksgiving. Now, we all know about the first Thanksgiving, right? Were there Indians there? Of course there were. Who's there? Your friends, right? You're not going to invite your enemies, not to Thanksgiving. So Massasoit and a few of his warriors were invited to cover the 40 miles and come enjoy the hospitality of the Pilgrims. They've just brought in their first harvest. By the way, that harvest was aided greatly by Squanto and a few other Native Americans who knew how to grow corn in the rocky soil of New England. Showed them how to fish. It's a pretty good harvest. And so they celebrated together their first summer of friendship with a harvest festival. A harvest festival, from which we have created a national holiday that we call Thanksgiving. Now, it's not like Thanksgiving was celebrated from that point on every year. It wasn't. But the memory was there of this first Thanksgiving, and in the middle of the Civil War, President Lincoln said, hey, perhaps we ought to have a Thanksgiving. So the Pilgrims invited their new allies, led by Massasoit. They thought a few dozen might show up. Massasoit showed up for the celebration with 90 of his warriors. Oh. This is a brand new alliance. We're not exactly sure what's going on here if we're Pilgrims. We're numbering maybe 25 or so males in the Pilgrims. Remember how many had died? Yeah. The ship had gone in April. Sailors are gone. They're outnumbered 4, maybe 5 to 1. But everything turned out okay. Yeah, there's no massacre. These are friends. And Massasoit realized that maybe there's not enough food here, so he sent some of his braves off into the woods, and they shot 5 deer. And so there were wild turkey, and there's venison, and there's corn, and there's pies, and there was no football. Game's not invented yet. But don't think that watching football or playing family, flag football is a bad Thanksgiving thing, because there were plenty of sports. Yeah, these are generally young men, warriors. And, machismo, to use a term from a completely different culture. Arrogance and pride. Yeah, look, this is my gun. Boom. Oh, these are my bows. Look how far I can pull that thing. And wrestling and drinking. Yes, Puritans drink. You guys like them a whole lot better already, right? Yeah, they're not Quakers. Quakers, no alcohol. Puritans, quaff some beers. All right. So it was a good time. Of course, the women had to wait on everybody. But everybody's still alive, right? At least those who had survived the winter. The test. Oh, they haven't already passed the test? Not quite. By 1623, so now we're 2.5 years in, Plymouth was a highly disciplined and successful community. under the leadership of William Bradford. That year, word reached the Pilgrims that their friend Massasoit was gravely ill. So I don't want you to think these people are living so close together that they see each other every day. They don't. We're 40 miles away, and it's by foot. Okay? So it's a couple days walk through the woods. So word comes that Massasoit is sick. Bradford now decides that he would send the best diplomat amongst them, better even than himself, a man by the name of Edward Winslow. I do want you to remember Winslow's name. Because Winslow, over these 3 years, had taken the trouble to learn the language of the Pokanokets and their customs. He actually admired and respected them in a way that most of the other pilgrims did not. And so Winslow and his party, they set off to go visit Massasoit to pay their respects and see maybe they can even actually help him. And on the way, they received word that Massasoit had died. Deeply saddened at this news, Winslow wrote in his journal. He said of Massasoit, he was no liar. He was not bloody and cruel. In anger and passion, he was easy to be reconciled to those who had offended him. So yes, he would get angry, but he would calm down and he could be reconciled. He ruled by reason, even to accepting advice from those of low status. And he governed men better with few laws than others did with many. He was truly loving when he loved. Winslow of Massasoit. You can look it up. Winslow now made a decision that turned out to be monumental. Instead of turning back and going home, he decided to go on to the Pokanoket village and pay his respects and attend the funeral. But upon arriving at the village, he discovered that Massasoit was still clinging to life. And some of the native women were around him and they were rubbing his arms and legs, trying to keep him warm, but they had no idea really how to help him. And it was difficult even for Winslow to get to Massasoit, his friend, because there were so many of the other natives around him. And so he gradually persuaded them to let him through, and he gets by the bedside. And he looks at the ailing chief, and he realizes that what he has is typhus. The mortality rate amongst Europeans for typhus is over 50%. People do recover. For Native Americans, I have no idea what it is, but it's very high. But Winslow could see that he hadn't eaten in a couple days. He was dehydrated, and he looked at his mouth, and this was the telltale sign of typhus. You have all kinds of pustules on his tongue and on his cheeks that looks kind of like furry, moldy. It's gross. And so the thing to be done is to get some food into him, but he can't swallow with his mouth this way. And so Winslow takes out his knife, and he reaches inside the chief's mouth, and he begins to scrape away the disease. This took 15 or 20 minutes, and then he was able to feed him some fruit. And Winslow later wrote that within the hour, Massasoit was recovering his strength. He lived. And he would continue to live for decades. And after he had recovered, he said of the English, the Pilgrims, "Now I see the English are my friends and they love me. And while I live, I will never forget this kindness." Now, later that year, Massasoit learned that the Massachusetts, the tribe north of Plymouth, that the Massachusetts were planning on attacking Plymouth and eradicating the settlement. And they had gone to the trouble of creating an alliance of some lesser tribes in the area who were going to aid the Massachusetts in this raid on Plymouth. And so now Massasoit sends a messenger to the people of Plymouth. It's an alliance, folks. And he tells Bradford of this plot. And he even tells Bradford what he should do. He said to Bradford that you should send an armed troop to the Massachusetts and attack them before they can gather their alliance and eliminate their leaders. And that is exactly what Bradford decides to do. And so this plot is put down. So it is absolutely essential to understand that in these years, and let's not spread this any farther than it goes, okay? But in these years we're discussing, race was not the primary factor for the Pilgrims. If it had been, they'd have been destroyed. Summary. The Pilgrims came to the New World to set up a community that would live as they believed God willed. A community of saints. Before they even arrived, that vision was compromised by the addition of the strangers. Still, the Pilgrims believed, even in the face of calamitous hardship, that their community was special. That God looked upon them with great favor. Remember, they see themselves as this new world people of Israel, okay? God's special people. This belief in their own exceptionalism and their own special destiny would become the most important legacy that the Puritans, the Pilgrims, left the American people. It has gone through many changes over 400 years. But it is still with many Americans to this day. Here then is one of the great themes of American history, and one of the great questions. Did God create America special or unique? Did God give America a special mission in the world? The belief that he did amongst the Pilgrims and amongst later Americans is called American exceptionalism. You can Google it. Every American ought to know this term. Whether you agree with it or not, you ought to know the term, what it means, where it comes from. American exceptionalism. We are exceptional. That's the belief. Okay? Unique. Called of God. Today, those who are antagonistic to Christianity and do not value American history are highly critical of the idea of American exceptionalism. It's in dispute. They do not believe that America is special, exceptional. They do not believe that America is even really very good. Perhaps you've heard the phrase, we were never great. See? We were never great. That is countering American exceptionalism. Indeed, the reason for casting doubt upon America's goodness is so that one can then change America to something radically different. Destroy the American people's belief in their goodness and their good qualities, and then you open the table to something completely new. Now, there are Christians, just to make things more complex, There are Christians who don't believe in American exceptionalism either, okay? Just to be fair. So it's not like all Christians on one side and non-Christians on the other. Whether or not God created America for exceptional purpose, and I believe he did. The Pilgrims and later Puritans gave America two tremendous gifts. We talked about these in the first lecture. The doctrine of separation of church and state, and of course, the beginnings of the ideas of democracy. But the Pilgrims in this first generation also provided a great example of cooperation with people of a different race and people of a completely different culture. There's a blueprint, folks, from 400 years ago. Okay, so now what are important questions from this lecture that I might take and put on an exam? What are the great themes? What are the great issues, moments, people, events? Yes?
Why were the Poconokids?
Poconokids.
Okay, why are the Poconokids willing to ally with the Pilgrims?
Okay, that would be a pretty good question, right? Why do they overcome their perhaps incipient racism to have an alliance with the Pilgrims? Yes?
How did Bradford's theology shape the Pilgrim?
Yeah. How did Bradford's theology or Pilgrim theology shape their response to trials, right? That's great, thank you. Somebody else, 2 or 3 more. Yes?
Why was Edward Winslow significant?
Yeah, why is Edward Winslow important, okay? In the test, the first section you come to is matching important people and what they did. Edward Winslow, who else is going to be there? Bradford's going to be there. Who else? Massasoit's going to be there. I'm not going to trick you. I'm not going to put up Massasoit's wife. Okay? I mean, obviously she was very important, especially to Massasoit and their children, but I don't know her name 400 years later. Okay? In fact, if I do recall my history now, he had several. Okay?
What about Dorothy?
Dorothy Bradford. Here's a good question. She's in the lecture. She's on the note guide. Might be important. What do you think? Raise your hand if you think she's on the test. We got a few takers for Dorothy. Okay. She might have been. Okay. What? She was only mentioned once in the lecture. Yeah. Okay. So there you guys are all analyzing. See? That's what I want you to do. I want you to take that analytical ability not only to this class, but to all your classes and say, is this important or not? See? And that's how you figure out what to study, what to try to remember. There are 2 or 3 other questions, but you're getting the idea. I will do this, hopefully, for every lecture, unless I'm short on time. But my point here is to teach you to analyze not only the lecture, but the reading as well, you see. All right, God bless you. I'll see you next time.